and your insight. And now I would like to invite Yossi Naar, the Chief Visionary Officer and co-founder of Cybereason.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to talk to you today a little bit about, give you a different perspective for defense and defensive operations. We think a lot about defense, and CISOs spend a lot of time thinking about how to defend ourselves, and we as a security company also spend a lot of time thinking about defense. What we don't really think a lot about is how hackers, think about us, how they perceive us. We think about their tools, we think about their mechanisms, but we don't really understand how they think about enterprise security. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that today. So, I'm sorry, skipped a slide, but it's fine. First, let's talk about how enterprises think about enterprise security. And this is a typical perspective of the way that we think about enterprise security. And, there's this classical layer model, from perimeter security all the way down to the mission critical assets. There's this perception of outside the perimeter and inside the perimeter. And we typically spend about 80% of our budget building that wall, building that perimeter. And then finally, there's this very familiar view of the security onion, this idea that there are all these layers that separate our mission critical asset from the threats outside. There's perimeter security, there's firewalls between us and the attacker. There's application security there to defend us, endpoint security, and of course, mechanisms for data security, all standing between the attacker and our most important assets. But hackers don't really share our perspective. They don't believe that this is what enterprise security looks like. And when they think about an attack, they think about it this way. They look for what they call the path of least resistance. Why should I work so hard and tunnel through all these complex layers of defense if I can, just go after the specific thing that I'm after? So, for example, if there's a web application firewall standing between the attacker and a particular server that they want to compromise, they only really need to get through that particular mechanism. And if they were able to hack that mechanism, they're in. And the same is true for remote access and control over endpoints inside an enterprise. All I really need to do in order to own an enterprise is to be able to convince some user to download my malware. And once that malware is running and I've bypassed the antivirus, and by the way, it's well known and well documented that antivirus solutions don't really deliver. And one of the reasons for that is that there's a free cloud service called VirusTotal that any attacker can use to test whether their malware is caught by any of the most up-to-date antiviruses in the market. And if they're able to run it through VirusTotal and get a sort of a clean check, it means that nothing is going to catch their malware. So that makes their life very, very easy. Once they've been able to do that, they're inside our enterprise. And if we believe that there's this wall that separates us and them, once they're over that wall, that's it. They're inside and they can pretty much do whatever they want. And the last technique I want to talk about has to do with authentication. As you probably know, there have been a lot of data leaks. Hackers love data leaks, especially password leaks, because users tend to use the same passwords over and over again. If I have a password that I found for some user, I can just try and access enterprise security mechanisms through that, with these credentials. And if I'm successful, if these credentials work, again, I'm in. And if there isn't a two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication mechanism in place in that particular enterprise, I'm basically done. I'm in. I have access to the thing that I'm looking for. So there was a survey done with hackers in Black Hat in 2017, just asking hackers questions about what techniques they like to use and what security mechanisms they don't like, that interfere the most with what they do. And I'd like to share some of the results here with you and think a little bit about what we can do with their perspective. So the first thing, really the first two columns here, talk about access to privileged accounts and access to email accounts. And this is really the sort of stolen credential story. If I already have credentials to a particular account, I can just use them and I'm in. The third bar here is access to an endpoint. Access to an endpoint can be gained through phishing a particular user and accessing their data, but it can also be gained by buying, going to one of the black markets and buying a pre-owned endpoint, using that endpoint as a starting point for my attack. Another question that was asked was, what are the biggest obstacles to penetration? And not very surprising, multi-factor authentication is a big hindrance to attackers. And this is for the same reason we saw before. They don't like and they don't want to work very hard when they're trying to hack us. If they already have credentials, they're going to try and use them. And if there's any mechanism there that's going to stop them from being able to exploit those credentials that they already have, well, obviously they don't like it. The second biggest thing is encryption. And encryption is a tricky thing. When done well, it can really, really help us avoid having our data extracted. Finally, they were asked, what's the easiest thing to bypass? And the number one thing was antivirus. And going back to what I said before, it's very easy to understand why. If they can use online services to check their malware at home and make sure that it's never going to get caught by any of the existing antiviruses, it's clearly a very easy thing to bypass. The second thing that they talk about is firewall. And really, this is because firewalls are irrelevant for most attacks. Unless I'm specifically trying to run a network-based attack, if I'm trying to attack any kind of endpoint, or if I'm trying to perform a credentialed access, there's really no meaning, there's no relevance to firewall equipment. And of course, there are a lot of techniques like hole punching that I can use if I really need to get through a firewall. But typically, what I need to do is just get some user to execute some malware on their endpoint and then contact me back, and the firewall is just not going to do anything there. So understanding that, let's try and use this information, because this is kind of what hackers do all the time. They understand how we work, they understand how people work, they understand our vulnerabilities, and they use them against us. So let's try and use what they're most afraid of against them. And let's start with multi-factor authentication. That's an easy win for any organization. And I work with a lot of enterprises, and unfortunately, multi-factor authentication is typically implemented in only partially in enterprises. There are a lot of assets, and only a small number of them really requires multi-factor authentication. And as we've seen, hackers don't like it, and it's very, very effective. The same can be said about encryption. Encryption, we know that it's effective, but encryption is relatively complicated to use, and so organizations tend to not apply it correctly. It is true that it's a complicated thing to do well, but it's worthwhile because it can really prevent our data from being out there. And the third thing is patching. Hackers don't like patching because, again, they don't like to work hard. If I can find an existing exploit and just use it, as was done, for example, in the massive NotPetya attack last year, it was a known vulnerability, it was a patched vulnerability that was used. But that doesn't matter because we tend to fail to patch our systems very quickly. And when we do, hackers have an easy way in, and they don't have to give up any 0 days in order to get in. The next thing is to take a bit of a more proactive attack. And the first thing I think that we should be doing more is active hunting. Hackers hunt us. They look for ways to get into our organization all the time. Penetration, when you talk to hacking organizations, penetration is 100%. They manage to get in all the time. They don't always manage to get to what they're going for. And that means that we have time, while they're in our enterprise, we have time to go hunting for them, to go look for them, and to disrupt their operation as early as possible. The second thing we could do is apply counterintelligence. There are a lot of companies today that provide not free intelligence, but they use black market information and they use open source intelligent resources to tell us things like, first of all, have any of our users' data been leaked? Is anybody targeting our organization? Anybody looking for any vulnerabilities that could be relevant to attack us? That's very valuable information that can help us target our defenses. And the final thing is using deception techniques. Lay traps for attackers, use honeypots, use whatever mechanisms you can within your network to sort of help attackers to stumble. The last thought I want to leave you with is this. Hackers don't believe in the perimeter. They don't think that there's a barrier that stands between them and us, between their network and our network. The way that hackers perceive networks is as this idea of a continuous layer or a continuous network where everybody has varying degrees of control. Some computers I own more, I have more access to and more control over, and some computers you have more access to. And I would argue, since they tend to win a lot of the time, their perspective is closer to reality. It's true that we have a lot of control over the computers and mechanisms that run within our enterprise. But since they are able to continuously gain access to our assets, means that we should be thinking differently about this, about the way that networks are set up. And we should think a little bit more like attackers and understand that there really is no perimeter, there is no wall, there's nothing stopping them from getting in, and we should treat every endpoint in our enterprise as a potential point of penetration and a potential point of compromise. Thank you.